So, given what we now know, right, a year and a half into this event, we have science, we have economic information, social information, voodoo. You know, what should be done differently if we were starting with a blank page? I think that's the first question I'd like to start with. Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, well, I try and put it simply. So, the 2019 WHO pandemic guidelines, they were published in October 19. Very comprehensive, decades of Western science, designed for pandemics bigger than this one. And they were completely ignored and thrown in the bin. And the Irish and UK guidelines were based on those. Again, they allowed for a pandemic much, much bigger than what we have seen with SARS-CoV-2. And they were ignored. And the emergency teams in Ireland were ignored. And the civil service body was allowed to take over, NPHET. So I would say, going back, we should have simply used the original pandemic guidelines.
But what would have that, can you just spell that out for people watching? What does that mean in practical terms?
The pandemic guidelines, WHO, there was no isolation of exposed individuals advised. In other words, certainly no locking down of asymptomatic people. So that's one of the big differences. And another way to put it is that Sweden essentially followed the traditional guidelines because their epidemiological people were in control, and they knew that our Western science, right, developed over decades, was good science. So they followed it. In the end, Sweden in 2020 had around a 0.03% excess death rate over normal, which is obviously tiny. But they did never lock down. They had kids in school up to 16 years old, all the way through, and they had people in restaurants, parties of four max, etc. They followed the guidelines.
Now, Martin, you were a director at the time of one of the areas of the HSE, I think one of the 6 regions, Dublin Midlands, right? And you were, you were involved in modelling. Why did we do that? Why did we not stick to our own guidelines?
Well, I'd slightly disagree with Ivor because this pandemic, and that's another discussion to have, was very different in the age profile and how important the age profile was in the death risk. And the fact that children were virtually immune to the disease or serious illness. And that would definitely have it did change. Okay, looking back, Eddie, you can be very smart, being the hurler in the ditch and all that kind of stuff. But I was actually a player on the pitch at the time. And I did advise frontline workers. We supported our hospitals and frontline workers getting PPE against the advice of NPHET. We advised again that the risk was in the nursing homes and they should be protected. And again, we were told to get lost. So there are 2 things that I would forget about World Health Organizations. They were obvious things that we should have done and didn't do, even though I told them to do them.
Okay. But as it stands today, have the WHO guidelines changed? Is it just, how is a pandemic going to be defined in the future once we get out of this? Are we looking at such a low threshold that we could go back into this scenario all over again?
Yeah, I think that's a massive problem. So we effectively have ad hoc guidelines since March when the WHO went to China. They looked at their classic Gompertz epidemic curve and they said China made that turnaround using lockdowns. The world must use lockdowns. So it's completely novel. But people also need to know that the definition of pandemic from WHO before 2008, it included a severity clause. It could only be a pandemic if there was severe sickness and death to the point that people couldn't work and businesses would fail, not based on lockdown, but based on so much sickness. In 2008, 2009, in the swine flu era, the WHO, and this is well documented, meeting with pharmaceutical senior people and others in Switzerland, I think, they quietly removed that clause. So a pandemic in people's minds is people are dying, and many people who died. That used to be the definition until 2009.
But Alan, can I just ask you, right, when we then turned on our television sets in March 2020, we had this dramatic footage from Italy. Lombardy went into lockdown, Italy went into lockdown, and it looked as if, this thing with a capital P, the pandemic, was really serious. So what was different about Italy and what is the situation now?
Well, I think we can go back even further than that, Eddie, and we can look at the pictures that were emerging from China. So people were quite terrified even in advance of Italy. I think Italy was what triggered the fear right across Europe and across North America. But if you look at China, and if you go back to the lockdown, where did the lockdown or the idea of lockdown come from? Because everybody knew that if you put in a lockdown, that would cause enormous damage. But what exactly were you actually achieving by that? Well, there was no cost benefit done in those. It was just a delegation that came from the World Health Organization, headed up by a guy called Bruce Aylward, and they recommended that China did a lockdown. It effectively turned the curve and was responsible for the good outcome in China, and therefore the rest of the world needed to follow it.
I think Eddie too on that as well. It's very important to understand that there's a very small number of actors that have been involved in all of this, and the groupthink that went global. People say, well, if everybody's doing it, it must be right. If we take, for example, Professor Neil Ferguson of Imperial College, his modelling out of Imperial College has been shown to be very flawed on previous epidemics in the past, but yet his modelling has been the one that's been most popularly followed by governments in the Western world. In a famous interview in November 20 to the Times of London, Neil Ferguson actually said, we looked at China and said we'd never get away with what they're doing. Then we looked at what they were doing in Italy. Then we knew we'd get away with it. That was the birth of lockdown for the Western world, following Ferguson again, not just his modelling, but now the methodology and the process, the appalling repressive process of lockdown. That's where it came from.
So we had at that point then, Eddie, we had our real world experiment happening. So we had these models that were being promoted primarily by the Ferguson team in Imperial College London, predicting mass death in the UK and Ireland and every other country that was applying that model. But we had our control country in operation in Sweden that wasn't applying those kind of lockdown measures. So basically you had your real world experience.
Well, can I just ask Pat a supplementary question then, right? Given your business experience, and come in if you want on answering the question. When you look at the structure we put together, NEFIT, right, which is made up of full-time, public paid people, right, making certain decisions, allowing them access to the airwaves and everything that evolved from that, plugging into RT and the feed of information over the last year and a half. Structurally, if we were starting from a blank page, what would you do? Would you set up an independent, multidiscipline panel and have a just advised government and let government make decisions? I mean, what should be done differently?
I think what should have happened really was we should have assembled the equivalent of a war cabinet. If we were so concerned, if we believed that this was such a serious issue, we should have assembled a wartime cabinet, even though we're in peacetime. There should have been a minister for vaccinations. There should have been a minister for getting the country back on its feet again. There should have been different ministers appointed for different things. Instead, we went to a very singular, narrow-focused advisory body of civil servants, not all of whom were terribly well qualified scientifically or medically, who were giving very stringent, very narrow advice from the singular focus of protecting the health service being overrun from COVID, to the detriment and the ignoring of all other public health matters, issues, and especially society and economic factors. There was no voice of reason to bring balance to the equation, and government just rubber-stamped what NEFIT and the CMO effectively told them what to do.
I want to bring Tracy in on just to push on a small bit. Tracy, back in March 2020, the government then passed legislation which impinged on individual freedoms, and that got you onto the pitch commenting as a barrister on what you were looking at. So what were your concerns at the time, and what are your continuing concerns?
Just firstly, I'll just say very quickly, just in relation to what I would have done differently, and it goes back to March 20. I would have trusted people. I would have trusted free citizens in a free society to look at the risks versus the benefits and decide for themselves what they needed to do. And if you actually look back at March 2020, on the 20th of March when the Health Preservation Act was passed, the regulations that enacted the lockdowns and everything else that went along, that closure of businesses, made it illegal for people to leave their homes, that wasn't actually enacted until the 8th of April, the first statutory instrument 121 of 2020. But if you look at that period between the 20th of March and the 8th of April, we probably had the highest level of compliance in that period, because people were saying, we don't know the data. We're looking at the pictures from Italy. We're looking at people walking down the streets in China falling down dead, and people acted cautiously. People acted responsibly. They acted in the way that you would expect adults in a free society to act. So I think the first thing that I would have done differently is I would have trusted people to make the right decisions. And in that 3-week period, people did do the right things. You saw when you went out to shops, they were nearly empty, the roads were empty, people were working from home. There was no necessity to actually bring in that legislation, that statutory instrument 121 on the 8th of April. And initially when they brought it in for a period of 4 days, from the 8th of April to the 12th of April, in order to test the waters to see what people thought about this. But people were still in that kind of mindset of, we don't know what's coming, so people were willing to accept it. But in relation to the legislation, I suppose, when I saw that legislation come in and it was passed within 48 hours, you couldn't really see the Dáil debates online, which you normally can see. You couldn't see how people had voted, which you normally can see. You still can't find that record. That's very concerning. But I suppose over that next 3-week period, we didn't know what was coming. We didn't know the extent of the statutory instruments that were going to be enacted. And when it was actually published then on the 8th of April, I know for myself personally, I was terrified that it was going to create a precedent that was going to be used into the future for COVID, for other viruses, for climate change, for anything. Because that's what happens with law. You set down law and it creates a precedent, and it's used.
So I'm clear. So the law is brought in, but it stays in place unless it's constitutionally challenged.
Yes.
That's how it works.
So what the Constitution says is that all laws enacted by the Oireachtas are deemed constitutional unless proven repugnant. So the burden of proof rests with the citizen, number 1, to get the lawyers on board, number 2, to get the money on board, and number 3, to get the courts on board. So it's up to the citizen to go in and challenge it through the courts to prove that it's repugnant to the Constitution.
Well, Alan Martin, if I can ask you, double barrel, address this question to you. I think that's a very interesting point about trusting the people, because if you look at the last number of weeks, we had this mask slipping with NPHET on the whole question of antigen testing, which seems to be ultimately about trusting, handing over control of running the affairs to the community, to the families, to the Irish citizens. And we had this almost ideological approach, anti-antigen testing from NPHET. Can you explain that? Medically, is that explainable?
The problem, Eddie, was that when it transpired that the PCR test was too sensitive, I think is the best way to describe it. So the problem with the PCR test is that yes, it does pick up infections, but it also picks up old viral fragments, things like that. So once you're using that PCR test, particularly when the epidemic phase is over, so once the curve has dropped down, there's not a lot going on in the hospitals, there isn't an awful lot of patients in ICU, not a lot of people getting admitted to hospital, that PCR test becomes a little bit troublesome at that point. Antigen testing would appear to be the perfect tool once it became available then later on in the year, to use that then to protect places like nursing homes, hospital settings, use it for aviation, for universities, to open up the economy again, while people were kind of trying to disentangle themselves from the fear that had occurred over the previous.
But for those listening who don't know, can you just simply explain what is the difference between a PCR test at a high level of magnification and an antigen test?
I think the most basic way to describe it is that an antigen test is positive when you're infectious to others. I think that's about as it.
You've live virus in your system.
It makes it the ideal screening tool, and Michael Mean is a professor in Harvard University who has spoken quite well about this and has been in conversation with our own Oireachtas and has got into some discussion with members of NPHET on the topic.
So if you just to the other side of that, Eddie, is if you use PCR to identify people with the infection who are infectious, 3 of the 4 you identify are actually not infectious at all. So if you use it to lock down people and isolate people and restrict movement, you are actually 3 out of 4 of the people you've said can't do A, B, and C is unnecessary.
So are you saying, so I'm clear, Martin, are you saying that cases, in inverted commas, that have been accumulated consistently by RT every day, the cases we've got, you're saying that 3 or 4 of the cases are not a problem?
Yep. As Alan was saying, when you have a low incidence within the country, when the peak and the spike is gone, yes.
Okay.
Now it varies. The higher the level of the disease in the country, the less false negatives you have. The other thing is that what's come out recently under Freedom of Information is that the running cycle is up to 40 and 45, which is utter lunacy.
That's the magnification of the PCR.
Yeah.
When you say utter lunacy,
well, beyond 25, 30 on, it's highly unlikely.
Effectively irrelevant because you're not infectious to others. You're not sure what you're picking up at that point.
But we don't know what percentage are in that 30 to 45 group. That's what we really need to know.
Okay.
But that's where you would actually want to use antigen,
Yeah.
ironically, to validate the PCR test.
But why did NPHET take such an extreme stance on antigen testing? Was it because they didn't want to lose control, as the point that Wills Tracy was making about trust?
They didn't trust the public, and they didn't put the most important element of public health on the table, which is the public and trusting the public, and saying we have a very valid, a very useful public health tool that we can distribute widely. We can use it for people who are visiting.
And it's much cheaper than PCR tests.
Are cheaper, much more useful in this kind of setting, and it wasn't availed of.
It's incomparable. So PCR, you might be a couple of days waiting for the result, which is a disaster. It's maybe up to €200. Antigen, you get the result in 20 minutes. And you can do a retest 12 or 18 hours later if you're going to go into an exposed setting and double check, and then its reliability goes right up to the overly sensitive PCR. So from an engineering perspective, if this was a complex engineering issue, no-brainer, antigen would be used massively and PCR would be used in a targeted fashion, depending on whether you were in a case-demic where nothing much is happening, like the summer in Northern Europe, or you're right in the middle of a seasonal surge, where PCR is kind of okay to use.
Well,
The collateral damage too, Eddie.
Yeah.
The collateral impact of this was enormous as well, because not only a high incidence, as Martin has said, a high incidence of false positives coming out of PCR, meaning non-infectious cases. But then we had the situation of the track and trace. So anybody who was a close contact of somebody who had a PCR positive, who in themselves were potentially not infectious,
which is
were then
magnified.
told to isolate for 14 days. And this was very prevalent, particularly among healthcare workers, where we actually ran short of healthcare workers because they were being sent home to isolate as being close contacts in case. And that had an enormous impact right across society, which was very damaging.
So it magnified something that had already been magnified.
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
We looked at actually the PCR last year because I suppose in the same way that everybody else, we thought this is the Achilles heel of everything that's happening at the minute, and we tried to see whether or not we could challenge the use of the PCR, but because we have the separation of powers in this country, it wouldn't be what's called justiciable through the courts. So the courts would say, well, that's a policy decision for the government, so you can't actually challenge their use of the PCR test. So that was a great difficulty for us in trying to actually bring a challenge against PCR through the courts.
There was a propaganda effect as well of using PCR, in my view. And this is just my personal view, but I think that PCR cases were used to instill fear and to sustain fear, and to keep us in lockdown. And I think that was the ammunition that was used for the news, 601 news every day. Cases, as opposed to hospitalisation would be produced, mortality numbers would be produced, but the main emphasis all the time, the star of the show all the time, has been cases.
Yeah, but what you're describing there, Pat, is propaganda, not news.
I believe it is, yes.
And
Going back to what Tracy was saying about the emergency powers and why people accept them so easily, and I think Martin has spoken quite a bit about this, is the fear that was generated, and the fear that was generated by the pictures from China, the pictures from Italy, and then the constant media propaganda, as you described, the cases every day. But those cases, as we learned as we went into the summer, the testing kept going, and what you ended up having was a wave of cases.
Well, can I just cut through all the noise for a second, just to the absolute bottom line, even though it's hard to do so, to get into the hard data, right? But we're now a year and a half in. We have global data, we have local data, and I'm going to ask you this, Ivor, when you look at the excess deaths caused by this pandemic, which we've commented upon, what are we seeing in Europe, what are we seeing globally, and what are we seeing in Ireland? When it looks, how many excess deaths compared to normal deaths in the population are we actually seeing?
Right, well, okay, I'll try and summarise that for a few different countries to give perspective. So Professor John Ioannidis and the WHO mounted his paper in October 2020. Nominally 0.15% is the death rate for this IFR. So think of that as the ceiling, you know.
So for people again listening, that's 0.15 of 1%.
0.15.
So that's less than
1%.
1%, it's less than 0.5%, it's less than 0.2%.
Yeah, 1 in 1,000
15
nominally.
and 10,000.
15 and 10,000.
So say 1 in 1,000 or whatever, 1,000 in a million. Now, in Ireland, you asked about the excess, and the excess mortality is a crucial way. The only way you can really measure a pandemic is in extra death over what would have occurred anyway. No one's using that measure, but it's the only one. So in Ireland, I'll give an example. 2020, our SARS-CoV-2 pandemic year, we had a huge spike in April. From the CRO, the GRO, and RIP.ie, and generally, around 32,000 people died in 2020. But in 2018, around 32,000 people died, give or take a few hundred.
But was 2018 an unusual year, or was it
It was a
normal
stiff
It's a
flu
normal
year,
flu.
but no one did anything about it. No one even noticed. But January, 3,650 died in January 18, because that was the spike for flu.
You were going to make a comment about the flu in 2018, Martin, were you?
Well, no, the flu in 18 was moderately severe,
Okay.
but as Ivor says, it went by and no one even noticed.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
the death rate in January, as Ivor just said, was huge, and it actually continued right onto the second week of April, and we did have excess deaths that year.
Do you know it's worth
But
actually,
the crew-
just for clarity, I think it's probably worth explaining excess mortality because a lot of people, including a lot of medical people, don't really understand that concept of excess mortality.
Yeah, okay. So excess mortality is if you have generally in country A, you have 1,000 people die per month, and let's say it's consistent. Then excess mortality is you get a bad flu and 1,200 die per month during the flu. So you have 200 extra over the 1,000 expected, so it's 20% excess. It is the only measure you can use, because you can only measure a pandemic by more people dying than would have died anyway. And interestingly, Martin, the January 18, 3,650 died in that tough January. April 2020, when we were all terrified by RTE, 3,700 died in April. So 2020 is around the same death as 18, and the peak month of April in 20 is around the same number of deaths as January in 18.
Can I then take it to the outlier at what we thought was the outlier at the time, which was Sweden? Okay, so because Sweden didn't do the lockdown, didn't do all of the things that we did, and was being beaten up badly, for doing so. So what has been the Swedish experience on excess mortality?
So if you correct for their age, demographics and profile, they're essentially, for all intents and purposes, around the same as Ireland. But the figures from Professor Michael Levitt, with this crucial excess death over what you would have had anyway, around 0.03 or 0.04% for 2020 for Sweden.
Okay, so that's 0.03 of 1%.
3 or 4 in 10,000 people with an age of death close to life expectancy. That is Sweden, with the kids in school up to 16 years old right through, people shopping, no problem, no masks ever, and up to 4 people per table dining, 1 metre space, which they didn't even follow because CNN went into Stockholm in May 2020 with an air of shock and horror, and they interviewed elderly women getting their hair cut, no masks. They showed people in the restaurants not even respecting the 1 metre. This is reality. But 0.03%, around 3,010 million people in the country, 300 per million, 0.03. That was their impact.
So interestingly, a few weeks ago, our Taoiseach Leo Varadkar put out a tweet where he was showing the excess mortality for many countries in Europe, and he was pointing out the fact that Ireland was near the bottom, so that we had done so well and that our lockdown was responsible for that. But the key point of that tweet was that 2 or 3 rungs above that was Sweden, so they had achieved pretty much the same, the lower third of excess mortality in Europe, very similar to Ireland, and yet none of the damage associated with the lockdown.
But can you then explain to me then, folks, just bringing you all in, right? Like, if you take the end of June, start of July, we had what has been called Black Tuesday, when the government basically surrendered to its technocracy, its medical technocracy, NPHET, on the issue of reopening, hospitality, on the grounds that, we're about to face another potentially post-Italian, outbreak of the pandemic. But given what's extraordinary for me, just looking in, how is that possible? How can we possibly accept that when you look at the science, the data, and the experience that we now know is there after a year and a half's experience in this? Can somebody explain that to me?
Well, the question was, how do you accept it? We can't accept it. It's so ludicrous, so off the wall. They talk about a worst case scenario. I'm not sure what a worst case scenario is, whether it's a chance of 1 in a million or something. Maybe there is a 1 in a million chance that we'd have 700,000 cases and 2,000 plus deaths. But that's probably in the same order of magnitude wrong as Ferguson's. It's probably out by a factor of maybe 12 or 13.
Which was that was what happened originally. So the predicted death toll in Sweden using the Ferguson model was in around 90,000, I think it was at the time, which was 10 to 12x what they actually got, independent of lockdown.
And when will we have the what do I call the break-even data? In other words, the actual collateral value, the value that's going to be put on the collateral damage caused by the lockdown policies, which you're stating really was the wrong way to go. When will we have that data, and what is it likely to show? Martin?
I don't actually know, and maybe someone around the table does have some idea when we'll have the data, but can I use the word modelling again? It's fascinating. Multiple studies by people who know what they're talking about have modelled this, Eddie. And the number of deaths caused by the lockdown, and they've been done particularly in Canada, and there's a recent one in Ireland, done in the UK, which the multiples in terms of deaths caused by the lockdown are 10, 20 and 30 times what were caused by COVID. But that's modelling. But how come that modelling is not accepted at all?
Sorry, I just want to pause you there because that's quite dramatic, right?
Well,
these studies are showing that the excess deaths caused by locking down is 20 times greater than the actual...
Ivor is a more expert in this than I am.
They vary, but there are always much more death from lockdown and societal health impacts from lockdown than SARS-CoV-2. They're always much worse. And some of them do go up into the factors of many tens. And some only say it'll be 5 times worse. But either way, we did an intervention that certainly would cause more suffering and death than any saving it made. So that is never going to change for the rest of time. Now the recent Irish one that's published, nice little study, I haven't gone through it yet. It's saying 25 times more societal damage, death and suffering, approximately, than we saved. And these studies assume that we saved quite a few people. However, there's a very good study that no one is talking about that models that if lockdown is successful and you do flatten the curve, the suppression of community immunity in the healthy during that period will cause Granny to be at greater risk the next time the virus triggers in the next season. In other words, the lockdown will even maximise COVID-19 deaths over the longer term. And I'll just add one final thing, and I know I don't want to take it all. Lockdown is proven now, insofar as you can in science, to be a useless intervention. And one example is Eastern Europe. Back in April, they were getting huge kudos for their amazing lockdown, Central Eastern Europe, and they all took the credit. When the next season came in, the reality was they had just missed the seasonal trigger of the virus. They got lucky. When the next season came in late 20 into 21, they began to have problems. So they had a reputation to keep. So they put in mega lockdowns and they masked everything, including the dogs and the cats. That's a joke, but they did mega lockdown and masks. What happened? The virus went right up in mortality and they ended up the worst in Europe, if you looked at both seasons. And Anders Tegnell, a year later, he said, judge me in a year, in spring 21. They interviewed him the other day and he was very delicate about it, but it was a tour de force of victory. He was correct on everything.
But back to Black Tuesday, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a data modeler. One thing I can do though is I can read, and sometimes I wonder whether our modelers in NPHET actually share that talent as well. But I read Public Health England published their numbers for Delta variant cases between the 1st of February and the 22nd of June this year. 92,000 cases. 1,340 required at least an overnight in hospital and 104 died. we had a forecast coming from Professor Nolan and Method that said, in the worst case scenario, 700,000 cases in August and September forecast potentially as a possibility, and 2,100 deaths. I don't need to be a scientist to know that I'm having my chain pulled, and I believe that Cabinet seriously had its chain pulled by Nevitt, and disgracefully they capitulated and went with such a farcical, bogus modelling concept.
Well, I'm not a medical person either, but one question I wanted to ask those that have looked at this with expertise here, because I'm coming to what I regard as the most serious question in just a minute, but I want to just get there with a sub-question, and that's that the evidence on mask wearing and controlling the pandemic. Can we talk about that, especially when it comes to children and the impact on them of mask wearing?
Yeah, the mask, I try to avoid that sometimes, and sometimes my sheer frustration as a highly technical person dragged me into it. The mask thing broadly is nonsense. So we have 40 years of research into this topic with influenza, similar virus, similar transmissions, and the answer was we can't find any use or any advantage. Sometimes they look better, sometimes they look worse. We had the answer. And then someone at a certain level decided we want masks, right? The big thing we were waiting for was an RCT, or randomized control trial. Now I knew how that would turn out because 40 years had already given the answer. Sure enough, it came up and showed no effect for masks for the wearer. It can't really test for the other person, but to be honest, it's aerosol. We know it spreads out the sides of the masks, out the top, everywhere.
But what do we know about the impact of the mask on the mask wearer in terms of...
Well, the mask wearer, I think the primary damage, and it's not to be underestimated, and enormous, is psychological damage. If you can tell your population in the middle of the summer, in Northern Europe, when the virus is gone and the hospitals are empty, every person must, under force of law, cover their face. That is an enormous step to take. That requires extraordinary, terrifying risk. Was the only thing that would justify you doing that to your citizens. But they did it. So that's the big thing. In terms of the impact, the latest study out a couple of days ago is in children up to 17 years old, I think, and they showed that the child with the mask, there was 6 times the concentration of CO2 or carbon dioxide inside compared to no mask. And they tested them with no mask before the experiment, no mask after, and during, huge levels, way above the safety levels for CO2 in a room. Now you can argue about how much that will affect the child, but strikingly the younger children with smaller lung volume who'd be more affected, they showed the highest parts per million levels of CO2 at all.
But what is significant about greater CO2?
Concentration, when you respirate, you release CO2 in huge amounts and your body must clear it. If you're a swimmer, you learn, you must blow out more than you suck in because you must expel the CO2. So CO2, when it begins to rise, it has toxicity. And in children who are developing, God only knows on concentration on anything else. But the experiment did not prove the effect on the human, but it showed that they lied to us last year when they all said, no effect on CO2.
Well, that then brings us to where we are now in July. And there seems to me to be a push now on to vaccinate young children, race between vaccination and Delta, and obviously you can see the background. It's about reopening the schools. So like what's your reaction to that? I mean, is that child abuse, or is it good science?
I think before you even get to that point, Eddie, you have to talk about COVID in terms of risk and how it is applied to each age group. So if you're in your 80s, the impact of COVID is significantly more than if you're in your 70s, and then the risk just collapses below 65 to the point that if you get below the age group of 25 years, your risk of dying from COVID is about 1 in a million. Kind of rough and tough would be about the
1 in a million under age 25.
1 in a million under age 25.
If you're healthy, yeah.
That's lightning bolt type risks, you know. And
you need to be clear about that, because otherwise you get pulled up on it. The official quoted figure would be much higher than that, but if you take Ivor's point, if you take people who don't have morbidity of any kind, as in disease like diabetes, respiratory disease, and particularly obesity. If you take those out, then the risk goes to levels Alan is talking about.
And when we go down then into children, what are we seeing?
Children, there was a very good study in America that looked at the entire, well, it was across the private health sector, which is most of America, all the child deaths under 14, and not one child who died under 14 years of age did not have some comorbidity.
So why the hell are we vaccinating children then?
Well, can I... Alan made the point, but it needs to be hammered home. And it might go back to a question that you asked ages ago. Is there a shift, a complete shift, a paradigm change, if you like, in the way medicine and society is thinking? Because now what we're doing, Eddie, is we're injecting and vaccinating our youth to protect our old, and putting the youth at a greater risk than they were at before. Alan, can you explain that? Because that needs to be hammered home.
I think we're into a very difficult scientific and ethical territory here at the moment. We are using young people and children to build a wall of defence for older people who are not just vaccinated, but by and large are at quite a low risk of dying from COVID anyway. Okay, unless you get into your 80s, your 90s with significant underlying illnesses. So that for me is a very, very dangerous place to be in medicine. The first tenet in the practice of medicine is first do no harm. There is the absolute potential for these, and we are seeing the evidence of it, that these vaccines can cause harm, and that if you are vaccinating a cohort of people who are of little or no risk to a condition, then that is dangerous territory as far as I'm concerned.
But how can parts of the medical profession, large parts of the medical profession, either be for this or worse, in my opinion, just be silent and let it happen? How is that happening?
Well, hang on. Eddie, these are very serious questions and they need serious thought and discussion. Maybe I'll start at the end by saying that there are Irish general practitioners who were asked to vaccinate the population, who were asked questions about the vaccination and its safety, and actually refused to use some of them. And one of them already has been struck off by the Medical Council. So there's a discussion there that could take all day. There's something wrong. There's something very wrong. And Alan just mentioned the bedrock of medical treatment, and that is first, do no harm. Or certainly do an awful lot less harm than the disease would do if you let it go. By injecting children, there is no doubt that you are putting them at a much greater risk than if you didn't inject them. And that's what I'm saying, that's a paradigm shift. There's something radically wrong, or there's a change in society's concept of what we need to do to protect everybody or anybody.
And I think absolutely we need to re-emphasise the figures. A person contacted me the other day and went to pharmacies, 7 or 8 pharmacies south of Dublin, and presented them with a series of questions, but also presented them, the pharmacist couldn't answer at all what the risk was documented from the vaccine, and could not at all answer what the risk would be for his 18-year-old daughter from COVID. He went through 7 multiple pharmacists, none could make a stab at either question. So he showed them that the Johnson & Johnson is a 1 in 10,000 in the literature from Johnson & Johnson, risk of clot, vascular or in other organs, and a long list of other risks. In fairness, Johnson & Johnson are honest. And then he said that a person below 25 in Ireland without a profound medical condition existing is in the order of around 1 in a million. So you're talking about a 1 in a million risk of death for his daughter, if that, to be honest, against a known documented risk from the medication. So that pharmacist is giving that person a very negative risk-reward treatment. Now, I treat it as a completely separate question, completely separate to that judgment. If the pharmacist says, okay, I agree this obviously is an utterly inappropriate medication for you, which it would be, from the numbers, right? But I think it might help your granny maybe, through transmission. Now the pharmacist has to back that up with science. And I tell you, they won't be able to. They won't be able to, because the science is not out there. Not to the point of giving someone a medication that's got a very poor risk-reward ratio.
Well, can I just throw Tracy a question? Tracy, is it the case then that there was a waiver brought in at the very start of all of this, where pharmaceutical companies were free from, being litigated by patients in court from the after effects of all of this? So the states did all that, including the Irish state. So what is the position today with regards to pharmacies delivering vaccines to people that ought not to have the vaccines on the basis of the science?
I would imagine, I understand that GPs got some form of an indemnity. I would imagine that the pharmacies did also. But if I could just go back to something else, I suppose, just in relation to mandatory vaccination and children. We've been trying to implement mandatory vaccination policies in this country for 100 years. So if you actually look back at the Dáil debates for maybe around 1927, you can actually see that we had a mandatory vaccination policy in this country for smallpox for children at the time. And this is when we were the Irish Free State, so obviously before the 1937 Constitution. But if you actually read through the Dáil debates, you can see that at the time, Wexford, apparently a large proportion of the population there, 17,000 to 20,000 people, had refused to vaccinate their children, and they were talking at the time about bringing in, enforcing the laws that were in place at the time. But if you move on then, I think to 1928, they were talking about bringing in a conscientious objector clause into the vaccination laws. But that's one thing, I suppose. They have been looking for 100 years at making vaccines mandatory in the country. But if you look, an awful lot of people don't actually realise this, we already have a framework in place in the 1947 Health Act in section 31 and 32 that permits the Minister for Health to implement regulations for immunisation for infectious diseases. So the framework is already there. It wouldn't even need to go through the scrutiny through both houses of the Oireachtas and be signed by the President. The law is already there. All they have to do is implement a regulation. But I think, that they're not going to do that. They're going to use coercive measures like what we see at the minute there with the indoor dining, with the vaccine certificate. That's the way they're going to do it. And if we look back at the Digital Green Certificate regulation that was passed through the European Parliament in April, at the time when Irish MEPs were lobbied, what they said was, no need to worry, this will never be used for domestic purposes, this is just for travel. Everybody knew once it came in, it's a stepping stone. First of all, travel. Now they're talking about bringing it in for dining. Yesterday I heard Catherine Mark.
But what does that mean in practical terms? What is he, what's the difference between that law and what would look like if that law didn't exist?
As in
other words, you're saying that that this law came in the EU,
yes.
and that would, it's going to go beyond, EU travel.
Well, it made it acceptable, I suppose. It's the same thing like with everything that happened. When the masks came in on public transport first, it made it acceptable. Then it was easier to bring it in for shops. So when they brought in the digital certificate for travel, it made it easier to bring it in for other things. It just became common. But I heard Catherine Martin just say yesterday that if it works for indoor dining, then we will look at the arts, music and entertainment. So if anybody thinks it's going to come in for one thing and not be rolled out for a host of other things, they're deluded.
So you're talking about vaccine passports as a license to move around.
Well, yes, I think it would be used for non-essential services. I think it would be very, very difficult to use it for anything that's considered essential, primarily because, and that's one of the reasons they didn't bring it into the workplace, because you have under the Constitution a protection to the right to earn a living. So you'd be able to take a constitutional challenge if they brought it into the workplace, whereas you don't have a constitutional right or a constitutional protection to eat indoor in a restaurant. So it's very difficult to challenge it, only maybe from a privacy point of view.
But
very clever what they've done.
But can I just pull all this together, just for a second, Alan, if I may, just to pull it together for a second. So what the conversation has established so far is that the science behind all this is very dodgy, just to use common speak. That the level of quality of information that is being given and broadcast is very suspect. I think that's pretty well established. The excess mortality point for me is the absolute nail in the whole thing, because that's hard data. I think that's very important. But yet we are still at a situation where we're now talking about injecting children with vaccines before the schools reopen. The Delta variant, being another potential scare. So given that, and I can say this because I have some media background, given that mainstream media which has been hollowed out over the last decade from social media, is very weak, was very weak coming into this, and is very dependent on state revenue from advertising support. Given that RTE has walked off the pitch, from my perspective, over a year ago, when it comes to independent journalism around this whole thing, and News Talk has become a magazine type radio station, and that left as it is, it's going to continue to do what it's doing, which is to continue where, that path, unless it's stopped. So given that's the case, right, what is the solution? I mean, if the state is absolutely convinced we're going to be the most conservative approach in Europe to getting ourselves out of this, what is the solution? Is there a solution? Pat?
There has to be a solution. What's actually happening here is really kind of an ideological shift towards zero risk. So life has always come with risks, but that risk has now been suspended. And to Tracy's very earlier point, the right of self-determination, the right of risk assessment for ourselves as individuals is being removed from us by basically a nanny state. That actually is what is happening right before us. What can we do about that? We look at Dáil Éireann, we look and see there is no effective opposition whatsoever. The opposition actually agrees with everything that the government do, which in turn is agreeing with everything that Tony Ulan actually tells them to do. And that is a really, really dangerous situation. We have a similar situation in the UK, or we have had up to now. Hopefully it's looking like it's beginning to shift, but over there we have the Labour Party as the main opposition, not acting like a responsible opposition either. So the problem is that we're not having our voices, or there's no check and balances on any of this going on. The amount of emergency legislation that's been rushed through the Dáil with limited time for debate, 2 hours been given to major topics of new emergency powers coming in, or the recent extension, the pairing nonsense between Sinn Féin and Fianna Fáil that Tracy very well amplified on social media over the last few days. This is wrong. So what can we do about it? We have to look to our values as a democratic society, and we have to decide, how we want to be governed in the future. And I think that people have to really seriously wake up and realise what's happening, and saying, watch what's happening. Is this the kind of life you want for your children and your grandchildren? Or are you going to do something about it? And doing something about it means putting into Dáil Éireann the kind of people that will be responsible, that will actually think for themselves, and will not kowtow to this dangerous shift in ideology, which says life is not about risk. Life is all about let's medicate our way out of this. Let us prevent. And the next big thing that's coming is the whole climate change thing. And I think that we're all being prepared for that, because if we acquiesce in all of these things and our civil liberties and our freedoms, we are going to be completely rolled over when it comes to unviable climate change policies that are being heavily promoted.
Pat, we can adapt and accept if society decides we're going to go completely risk averse, and that's the new mindset. That's grand. But can I go back to something you mentioned in your preamble there, and we haven't discussed it at all, and that's the variance. Like, the variance is the backbone of the scaring technique that's been used for the last 9 months. Now, someone needs to stand up and say, this is a complete red herring. It's a complete hoax. And using every new variant as an excuse to carry on needs to be addressed. It is the greatest hoax of all time. They're all just variants. The vaccine is effective against them all. Each one is successfully less lethal, maybe more transmissible, but less lethal than the last. So, like, if you want to be risk averse, fine, but start telling the people the truth and let them make the decision. I suppose that's what Tracy is
But I
saying.
think the point is that's on the path we're on, that's not likely to happen unless there is the beginning of mass disobedience around the rules that are being imposed.
Well, yeah, the variants, I agree totally, Martin. The variants, or scariants as we call them, UK in April already was getting large percentages of cases to be the Delta variant, which was the Indian variant. So now people think there's two. They're actually the same thing. By May it was 50-60%, and coming into June it was up at 80, 90, 100% of all tests were Delta. We know that the fatality rate for that is 0.1% from UK figures. There is no extra fatality. The hospitals and the ICU all stayed pretty much flat, as Delta completely took over. And we know the Delta variant in India, they happened to have a seasonal surge which curled over. And that happened to be the Delta variant. So they attached India's experience, right, to its variant and then said that can be scary over here. But that was just Indians' time to rise and fall. The fact that it was Delta had nothing to do with it. So you've got to ask the question, why are they using patent nonsense to continue to terrify the people and implement useless lockdowns, which we know from 40 or 50 published papers don't do much? What's driving them to do this? And how do we get at these people? And then I think you are absolutely down to civil disobedience. Because how do you get to these people if they are effectively a dictatorial, totalitarian cabal, NPHET, linked intimately to Zero COVID and ISAG, the Zero COVID group, and clearly enthralled with their power and knowing they have full power over all politicians who will simply rubber stamp.
Can I just pause you there? I think we've reached a very important question, very important point in the discussion, and it's this. People watching and listening to this discussion, a lot of the information they may have heard, but a lot of people will be listening and this will be new information to them because they haven't stepped over the line or broken out of the bubble they've been in up until now. So what do we say to them? What can an individual viewer do at an individual level as a pushback against this, to send the message through that you know, not a step back? That this is as far as we're going to go.
You can tell them the science behind masks, the science behind social distancing, the science behind most of the measures used is not there. There's no justification for most of the measures. We've already heard from Ivor about the lockdowns. That's been discussed. But the worry, Eddie, is that we can tell them these things till the cows come home, and it's not, up to now, has had zero effect. The terrorising effect has been 100% successful. To put Goebbels to shame, or McCarthy in America to shame, it's the same kind of phenomenon.
No, that's accepted, Martin. But my question really is not addressed to the bulk. I'm talking about the people, the marginal movement of people over the side. What do we say to them today? What can they do in their own families, in their own communities to get the information out? What leadership can they show in their own way?
So, and we can put the links below this wherever it's shared. 180,000 two-sided leaflets just went out all across Ireland from a group who did take leadership and put together the facts that we've discussed in a simple format, and they're hand-delivered in doorways all over Ireland. People could jump on those kinds of campaigns, print out, share. That's just one thing. We're thinking of, actually, we could do one for the Gardaí, especially targeted at the Gardaí, respecting them hugely for the restraint they have shown, giving them the basic facts as we've discussed, and telling them, come autumn, they will be asked to do things which are against the interests of the Irish people, and to ponder and think, do they have children themselves? Do they want to see a future that this clown show is heading towards, or not? They'd be important. So I think people can engage. Maybe we will put with this when we share it, we'll put a list of links where people can engage and try and take back our society.
If we get critical mass, a critical mass of people writing to their elected politicians, you might get somewhere. I think the independent TDs have been excellent on this. They haven't been blinded by party politics. But I think if people continue to write to their politicians and tell them their individual stories and tell them about conversations such as this and link them some data and things like that can have a big impact. The other thing I'll just mention very quickly, sorry, just to go back to it, in parallel to this, I actually think, I just need to call it out here, I think NPHET's position is untenable. I mean, as an advisory group, if you are managing any company, if you are managing a sports team, if you do not reflect on the real world data and you're still using modelling that has been proven to be very troublesome and essentially useless, and you don't change tack, you don't review it, you don't look around the world and have a look at the experience of places like South Dakota, Florida, Texas, Sweden, all of these other places that have had better outcomes in a lot of instances than a lot of countries that applied hard lockdowns well, then you're not doing your job properly. And in that instance, you know, you're not serving the people of Ireland.
And I would say what
Yeah.
people can do. I would hope that people watching this on social media or whatever platforms we would have this aired on, but I would hope that people watching this would think about watching it as a group, with either within their family or with their friends. I would like them to regard it almost like a book club event, review this discussion that we're having here, then hold their own discussion, and then start to post on social media what their actual views are, because I think that by talking to each other, they will educate themselves, and they will actually get a chance to look at the counter-narrative to the narrative that we've been force-fed up to now. And I think that the Irish are brilliant at talking and examining things, and I think that we have to encourage that. People need to examine. Stop taking everything you hear on the news as gospel. It's not. Stop listening to prime time and all of these programs as if it's the only truth, because the experts that are on there generally are from one side of the narrative and one side only. So people have an obligation to themselves, to their children, to their grandchildren, to first of all educate themselves to what is really going on, and then to consider how they can play a part in showing local leadership in bringing about the changes that are actually needed before it's too late.
Well, Alan is a bit of an expert in psychology. I'm totally pessimistic that will work, Pat. I really am. The level of indoctrination, brainwashing, for me, I wouldn't have, but if you told me it would happen 2 years ago, I would have told you you're off your head. I just, even today, I can't understand friends, people who are completely immersed in it, and that they would sit down and discuss it is not going to happen, Pat. What do you think, Alan?
Well, I'm talking now about the fringe, the people, the marginal movement.
Well, I'm not
just
sure
the
you're
marginal
talking about
movement.
1% or 2%, but I haven't seen them, sadly.
I think tipping point is often talked.
Yeah, sorry, Alan, you go ahead.
Yeah, so people are desperate to get back to normal. And going back to the vaccination topic again, I've spoken to a lot of people, say my age and younger, and the vast majority of them have chosen to be vaccinated. The reason is so that they can travel. The reason is so that they can participate in society. It's nothing to do with health. It's nothing to do with... They really don't feel that they're at risk from COVID, but they want to participate in society. If our government and our health authorities and our medical professionals have got to the point where they have effectively coerced the population into taking an experimental medication in order to live their lives, I think that is an absolute travesty, a disaster.
Something that I think that's really scary is freedom is no longer considered a human right. It's something that the government gift you, and they give it to you and they take it away depending on, you know, how many cases we have in the population at the time. As well as that though, I think when Alan was saying about, you know, people just wanting to be able to get back to normal, I just heard or saw a tweet there this morning from a restaurateur in Galway. So somebody who had been wildly supported by, I suppose, everybody that's on our side of the table for the last 18 months in relation to you should be able to open your business and you should be able to earn a living. And I saw this guy come out this morning, he was actually talking to Sarah Kelly on News Talk, and he was saying, you know, she was asking about the vaccine passport and he said, yeah, I'll implement it, I just want to get my business opened. So the people who have been supporting him for the last 18 months, he's literally going to throw us to the wolves now in order to just get back to normal. And I think for me, I will absolutely boycott any business that implements the vaccine passport. I feel terrible for them that they may lose their business, but at the end of the day, human rights has to trump everything. If we're willing to sacrifice now for into the future, you know, what are the children going to say? What are the grandchildren going to say?
It's quite shocking. But yeah, the coercion, it is pure coercion for the last few months. And the other point you mentioned, which we'd forgotten to say, my person who went to all the pharmacies, he's not my person, he asked, is this a fully approved vaccine? And the answer was yes, across the board. And then he showed them that the trials don't end till 2023, that the cycle is nowhere near complete, and they're under an emergency use authorization, an EUA. In other words, extreme circumstances with no other way out, emergency use. How can you apply that to a 22-year-old who's basically zero chance?
So on the basis of that test, and I know it was just Wicklow, does it look as if a large number of the pharmacists themselves are unaware of the position with regards to the vaccines?
Incredibly so, across the board, with tiny exceptions. In fact, one pharmacist got visibly upset and followed the person out and apologised and said they had no idea. Now, as a younger pharmacist, but it'll give you the degree of ignorance out there. Like, how can people not know it's on emergency use authorization?
So it's probably worth explaining what that is.
Oh, yeah.
It basically means that the vaccination isn't licensed. It means that it can only be administered under what's called an emergency use authorization, and there are some criteria that must be applied in order for that to be met, which are that there are no available treatments and that we're in a state of emergency. So we're in a state of emergency, we're in lockdowns, World Health Organization. As far as they're concerned, we're still in a pandemic scenario or a pandemic situation. But we know that there are available treatments, and some of the information around that has been suppressed, and that probably brings us on to one of the other big topics of the last 18 months, which is censorship across the general media, censorship across social media, censorship in quite shockingly in the medical profession.
Can I go back on some of this experimental medicine, because that's what it is, and it isn't licensed. And again, I've mentioned bedrock already, but I'm going to mention it again. Bedrock is of any kind of intervention. It doesn't matter whether it's medicine, taking out a scalpel, or even talking to someone medically. You need informed consent. The people who, as Ivor has pointed out, the people who are administering this don't know enough about the medicine or the vaccine to inform anyone. So therefore you can't get consent. I know medical students in third and fourth year medicine in colleges who have been brought out to the various centres to vaccinate, and they haven't a clue about any of the side effects, or else all they're doing is sticking needles into people who are not informed, don't actually give consent. So there's something very wrong here. And as Alan has said, the medical profession is just standing back. And I think it's no more than the legal profession. We're all a disgrace, really.
Well, listen, I just want to bring this to a natural wrap, right? Where we ended up was we got to talking about what people on the margin who might move over away from the, let's call it the propaganda or the bubble, which is what we would see it as, to taking personal action. We talked about get behind campaigns, talk to local Gardaí, we all know them. I think also talk to GPs and pharmacists along the lines we've discussed. I think I thought Pat's point about organising like book clubs and gatherings to watch these type of discussions and starting your own discussion in your own community or in your own family is very, very important. I accept Martin's point entirely, that mightn't work, that the level of indoctrination is so high, but let's just address the margin for the moment. I mean, we're now well into July, coming into August, schools are reopening. I think Tracy's point is where I'd like to finish, really. Tracy is suggesting that any business that just relies entirely on vaccine passports to get access into it should be boycotted. I think that's on the table.
The fear is that an awful lot of people say that don't get the vaccine, that they might just say, well, sure, I'll just have the outdoor dining, I'll just dine outdoors. I'm not willing to be told once I try to enter a business when you can sit outside there and everybody else can come inside. Yeah. I'm not willing to do that. Well, I'm not willing to be treated as a second-class citizen based on my private medical information.
Yeah.
But are we reaching that point? I mean, are we reaching that point of disobedience along the lines of taking counteraction to boycott organisations that are using vaccine passports as the sole entrance into their property or into their event?
I think I'd agree with Tracy. It's actually our obligation, because we know the facts that we went through today. We know it is an utter absurdity for a 0.1% mortality, average age of passing, right, close to average life expectancy. We have all the data now. It's an endemic virus all over Europe. It's been through 2 waves with huge PCR positivity in each wave. We know it has riddled the populations. So there'll still be some effects in the coming winters, but the lion's share is behind us. And we have the magic vaccinations now pretty much deployed on top of that. So the idea of a permit to live your life anywhere is abhorrent. It is utterly abhorrent. So there's a duty on people who understand this, even if they're in the minority, right, to push back.
I'm just going to say, one of the reasons I think it's really, really important to boycott the businesses is because we're now in July. They're talking about having the system operational around the 19th of July. But just remember, July, then August, then September. The idea is to try and get the kids vaccinated before they go back to school. There's going to be an issue constitutionally with putting anything into law about vaccinating children, because we know Simon Harris went to the Attorney General in 2019 to check it, and what they said at the time was that it would be tricky because it would invade on the right to bodily integrity and also the right to primary education under the Constitution. So there's an issue with doing it constitutionally in law, so they're going to have to employ some form of coercive measures. So if people aren't willing to take a stand now in relation to indoor dining, their children are lost. So it's not just us, the people who don't want to take the vaccine for ourselves. They're coming for the children. I don't have children. I shouldn't have to be standing here telling people who do have children, this is your fight. But it is their fight.
And Tracy, this boiling frog has typified the whole thing. Everyone always 2 or 3 weeks to flatten the curve, right? That's 16 months ago. Right? Then it was this, then it was that, then it was masks in the middle of the summer with empty hospitals and ICUs. Right, mandatory masks. What insane guy has taken over? Well, it wasn't insane people. It was whole quangos and international bodies who drove that. But people put on the mask. The moment you put on the mask when it's nonsensical, right, you are just handing over your whole authority to someone else. And I love that quote. I'm not sure who it's from. If you can make the people believe absurdities, you can make them commit atrocities. That was a lot of insight. I think 100 years ago. It could have been Solzhenitsyn or someone. But if you can fool the people, right, absurdities, and get them all to swallow it, and look around us for the last 16 months, who knows where it's going? And I think this boiling frog now is getting to fever pitch with what we discussed in the last 10 minutes.
Well, it's the security.
Ivan, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. Can't let these people get away with trying to fool all of the people all the time.
Well, can I?
So Benjamin Franklin's quote about security and safety.
It
those who trade a little bit of security for a lot of safety will get neither and deserve neither.
Yeah, that was it. He well, it's a bit sexist back then. He who is willing to trade his freedom, I think, to attain a little more safety or security, deserves neither and will get none, or to that effect. In other words, if you feed a totalitarian system, which this unfortunately is in all of its vector and direction the last year, if you feed it, it will grow and grow and it will come and eat you someday. I mean, I don't know where this is going.
Well, can I just put this as the wrap point? Really, we've gone through a lot. I found it very interesting, so thanks very much for coming and participating in the discussion, and hope that those on the margin out there will pick up the cues that we've given. But I'm just profoundly impacted by what Tracy has said. That really we're at a point now, and it's a red line, and that red line is vaccine passports, because it's creating a segmentation or division of Irish society that has very, very dangerous knock-on effects if it is successful. So are we suggesting therefore that those that engage in using vaccine passports should be boycotted? Remember, boycotting was something that was originally brought up in Irish history during very dark days, during the Land League days, and Tennessee Captain Boycott. Are we calling for the return to the Irish boycott?
Well, it's a tricky question, and I agree with everything Tracy has said, but it is a tricky question. If the government make businesses do this, i.e. you cannot open your doors unless you enforce this, well then those businesses are going to close. And so now you're into proper moral hazard at this point, whereby like if you initiate a boycott against a business, that if they were to choose the other path, they're going to lose their business in any effect. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place as well. So it is very, very tricky territory. So I find the idea of vaccine passports and the segregation of the population along the lines of health status unbelievably totalitarian. I think that is a really, really dangerous direction that we've taken with this.
I'd agree with Alan, I must say. I don't see it quite as Tracy does, because on the basis you're talking about fringe, you've mentioned a few times, Eddie, the vast majority of people are not on the fringe. They're going to get vaccinated and they're going to go and support these institutions or these restaurants and pubs which is great. So a few of us deciding to boycott the fringe is not going to make any difference, and it'll have zero impact.
But it does make a difference to you when you're doing the right thing.
No, it makes a difference.
I think it's about doing the right thing
Principle.
regardless of the consequences.
No, I'll do it for myself, but it'll have zero effect on trying to get out of this mess with the country.
Now, there may be establishments as well that it may turn out are not very focused at all on checking these, because I think another thing to keep in mind is I had work done recently, and every single tradesman, around 7 or 8 different trades in, every single one was 100% on our side, to the point of anger. Also the guy in the recycling centre, also many people I've polled in stores. So it seems like the working classes of Ireland on the lower end jobs, there's a massive amount of awareness that this thing is insane. But in the pampered Rathfarnham and Donnybrook, professors' classes, I have a daughter in college, she said it is unreal. They are literally, she's in the medical kind of sector, they are gushing about the vaccines for kids. Gushing about the vaccine. So isn't it an interesting thing that our whole kind of side of the house now is common sense people, Maybe there's more there who will turn.
Just when you're saying though about them potentially not policing it, that's what happened initially with the shops. That's the reason there wasn't a requirement for evidence in the shops in August of 2020 when they brought in that statutory instrument 296, and that was a month after they brought in 244, the public transport, which did have a requirement for evidence. But if you see now over the last 6-12 months, shops are policing it. So once it's brought in, it is that type of a stepping stone, to bring it into other industries, and they will eventually start policing it when they see everywhere else police it. So I think, even if we think it might be brought in and some some restaurants or bars or wherever won't actually police it, they will eventually police it. And it'll be partly self-policing, because other customers will be saying, well, I didn't see you checking anybody at the door, or they'll be reporting them to the guards, or their employees will be reporting them to the guards. So it will eventually be policed. That's why we have to stop it now before it comes in.
And I agree, and when you say that, I must say East Germany is all I can think as you talk. Just think of the rhetoric, just think of the absurdity. We are sitting here with a bad flu equivalent disease that's now endemic across Europe and is pretty much way past its worst, and a vaccine's been deployed, and we are actually sitting here talking about showing your papers to go in to get a burger. Isn't it insane that we are sitting in this world?
Equally, where we're sitting is that we've now been made divisive against each other.
That was part of the...
Even around this table, we have different views on this. My heart goes out to any business person who's doing their utmost to try and stay alive and feed their families. And it is just shocking that individual citizens of the state are put in that position of having to even think about boycotting or not giving somebody business. I find that reprehensible. I think that alone is the reason why Tony Holohan and NPHET need to be stood down immediately. It's why government need to feel the ire of the people. They should not allow this divisiveness. They should not be bringing children into play, the vaccination of children as the price of going back to school. This is outrageous blackmail, and we have to call it for what it is. And people have stop being lazy. That's what I said to anybody watching this. Stop being lazy. Educate yourself. Look at what is going on. And bloody well do something about it in your local community, with your local TDs. Do something about it. Stand up and be counted, and stop being politically correct all the time. Stand up and be counted.
Imagine things became so divisive that in May of this year they set up a hotline in Donegal for people to report breaches of COVID-19 at a time when the legislation was very, very restrictive, and the Guard said at that time that 60% of the calls that were made to that hotline didn't actually, once they investigated, they weren't breaches of COVID. So can you imagine what neighbours were reporting neighbours for when the laws at that time were extremely restrictive? That's the type of society that we've created now.
2 years ago, you go out to dinner, you wouldn't dream of asking somebody, do you take medication for any condition? That would never, ever come up in any kind of normal society. And yet it's perfectly acceptable now. Are you vaccinated? And it gets divisive, people kind of...
Well, I'm going to suggest, right, I'm going to stop it here now, because I think we have some natural conclusions. But the one for the tape that I'd like us to end on is the last thing that Pat said. I think he just summarised it, he just nailed it.
And it's a call to action as well, love it.
Yeah.
We've now been made divisive against each other.
that was part of the
Even around this table, we have different views on this. My heart goes out to any business person who's doing their utmost to try and stay alive and feed their families. And it is just shocking that individual citizens of the state are put in that position of having to even think about boycotting or not giving somebody business.
Yeah.
I find that reprehensible. I think that alone is the reason why Tony Holohan and NPHET need to be stood down immediately. Is why government need to feel the ire of the people. They should not allow this divisiveness. They should not be bringing children into play, the vaccination of children as the price of going back to school. This is outrageous blackmail, and we have to call it for what it is. And people have stop being lazy. That's what I said. Anybody watching this, stop being lazy. Educate yourself. Look at what is going on. And bloody well do something about it in your local community, with your local TDs. Do something about it. Stand up and be counted, and stop being politically correct all the time. Stand up and be counted.